Okay, session 3. Session 1 was there's one plan of God centered in Jesus Christ. Second essential of New Covenant theology is that the Old Testament must be interpreted and applied in light of the New Testament. Third principle is that the Old Covenant was temporary by divine design. In other words, it was always God's will that the Old Covenant, the law, be temporary. So I want to point us just to a few key passages to demonstrate this. Probably most famously is Galatians, the book of Galatians. I love Galatians, New Covenant theology. People love Galatians, this Arcady von Bora. And part of it is because it's addressing the very issue that we are. We're addressing the issue, the relationship of the law and the Abrahamic promises and the New Covenant and their how they fit together. And so it answers our question really neatly. So I'm in Galatians chapter 3, and let's start at verse 15. To give a human example, brothers, even with a man-made covenant, no one annuls it or adds to it once it's been ratified. Now the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. It does not say, and to offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Christ. This is what I mean. The law, and again, by law, nomos, Paul means law covenant, Old Covenant. This is what I mean. The law, which came 430 years afterward, does not annul a covenant previously ratified by God so as to make the promise void. For if the inheritance comes by the law, it no longer comes by promise, but God gave it to Abraham by a promise. So again, if the old covenant was temporary by divine design, it had to have a definite starting point. And here we learn that it did. Now we would learn this just from reading the Bible, starting in Genesis. But here, just to be reiterated and confirmed, Paul says it started 430 years after. Now this is in conversation with covenant theology that says the law is eternal. Paul says the law of Moses is not eternal. It started, it had a starting point, and it was 430 years after Abraham. Let's keep reading, Galatians 3:19. Why then the law? It was added because of transgressions. And notice these time indicators. Until the offspring should come to whom the promises had been made, and it was put in place through angels by an intermediator. Now an intermediary implies more than one, but God is one. Is the law then contrary to the promises of God? Certainly not. For if a law had been given that could give life, then righteousness would indeed be by the law. But the Scripture imprisoned everything under sin so that the promise by faith in Jesus Christ might be given to those who believe. Now, before faith came, and faith here is not talking about our own subjective faith, but it's talking about the era of faith. He could have said New Covenant. Before the New Covenant came, before Jesus came, before faith came, verse 23, we were held captive under the law, imprisoned until the coming faith would be revealed. So then the law was our guardian until Christ came in order that we might be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we're no longer under a guardian. Stop there, but just notice, again, if there was a definite starting point 430 years after Abraham, here there's a definite ending point. He says it several times, until faith came, until the offspring came, until the Messiah came. And so the law was temporary by divine design. That's what that word guardian means there that we read in Galatians chapter 3, verse 25 and verse 24. And the King James translated this tutor, which actually is not quite right. In first century Greek, there's a different word for guardian and for tutor, didaskalos. So this word here is pedagogos, and really probably the best translation. Guardian's fine, but one of the better ones might be nanny or babysitter, because in the first century Greek world, you would have a pedagogos, guardian, who would take the child to the school to learn from the teacher, the didaskalos. So the idea here is that it was temporary, and eventually you'll reach maturity, which Galatians 4 is going to talk about as well. So very clearly, temporary in God's plan. Let's consider 2 Corinthians chapter 3. We'll pick it up we'll just start at verse 1. Are we beginning to commend ourselves again? Or do we need, as some do, letters of recommendation to you or from you? You yourselves are our letter of recommendation, written on our hearts to be known and read by all. And you show that you are a letter from Christ, delivered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. Such is the confidence that we have through Christ toward God. Not that we're sufficient in ourselves to claim anything is coming from us, but our sufficiency is from God, who has made us sufficient to become ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Now, if the ministry of death, carved in letters on stone, notice he just called the Old Covenant a ministry of death. Now, if this ministry of death came with such glory that the Israelites could not gaze at Moses' face because of its glory, which was being brought to an end, will not the ministry of the Spirit have even more glory? For if there was glory in the ministry of condemnation, the ministry of righteousness must far exceed it in glory. Notice these comparative terms. Indeed, in this case, what once had glory, the Old Covenant, has come to have no glory at all because of the glory that surpasses it. For if what was being brought to an end came with glory, much more will what is permanent have glory. Since we have such a hope, we're very bold, not like Moses, who would put a veil over his face so that the Israelites might not gaze at the outcome of what was being brought to an end, but their minds were hardened. For to this day, when they read the Old Covenant, that same veil remains unlifted, because only through Christ is it taken away. Yet to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their hearts. But when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. It's removed, and now we can rightly read Moses. Now we can rightly read the Old Covenant. This is a Bible reading context here. Now, verse 17, the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's freedom. And we all, with unveiled faces, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. Very clearly, this contrast here between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. The Old Covenant was always intended to be temporary. And we know that from other passages. In Romans chapter 6, not under law, not under the Mosaic covenant, but under grace. There's this contrast that we read about. Or Romans chapter 7, verse 4, we've died to the law so we can be married to another. These kinds of passages are all over the New Testament. And we learn from Hebrews chapter 8, which has this quotation of Jeremiah 31. It's actually the longest Old Testament quotation in the New Testament. And the argument of Hebrews again and again is, look, this is on its own. The Old Testament itself teaches us the obsolescence of the Old Covenant, because in the Old Testament itself, Jeremiah 31, it promised a new covenant. And by promising a new one, it shows that the old one is on its way out. It has an expiration date. And so it was always intended by God to be temporary. The Old Covenant was temporary by divine design. Now again, got some books to hopefully help you if you're interested. I would recommend this little one. Most of my books are small. You can read them quickly, but a book called The Newness of the New Covenant that lays out some of these passages in more detail. So third point, Old Covenant, temporary by God's plan.